Try to. Yeah, Next Level Trails was announced last year, and it's going to invest $90 million, the largest infusion of state trail funding in Indiana history, toward the development of regional and local trails across the state. DNR is going to administer Next Level Trails in conjunction with INDOT. This is a quote from Governor Holcomb when he announced the program, and there's two themes in this quote that I want to call your attention to that run throughout this program in the way that we've designed it, and that is connectivity and collaboration. You'll see those themes woven into the way that we've designed the program and the way that we evaluate projects, and that's really two really important parts of this program for us. So we'll begin by giving you an overview of how Next Level Trails works, and then later we'll dive into the application process. The $90 million has been divided into two components. Regionally significant projects, $70 million is devoted to those projects. That has a $250,000 minimum grant request and a $5 million maximum per applicant. And then local projects, $20 million is set aside for those projects, $200,000 minimum grant request in that program, and a $2 million maximum per applicant. Regional projects are going to tend to be projects that create connections between communities. They're going to be longer distance. Many of them will be on the Visionary Trail system, if you're familiar with that. And we'll get into that a bit later. But they tend to be larger landscape, longer distance trails. And the local projects are geared towards trails that create connections within a community. So, for example, connecting neighborhoods to schools, connecting schools to parks, residential areas to commercial areas, those types of projects that have more of a local impact than a regional draw. And both are important. That's why we divided the funds such that we would be able to do some of both types of projects. We're going to be awarding these funds in rounds. There will be a total of 3 rounds. The first one was announced last winter in December, and the first round was awarded in May. The second round we just recently announced. That's why you're here, of course. And it will open on October 1st, and the deadline is November 1st. We've tried to build in more time for the second round than we did in the first round. The idea with the first round was to move quickly to try and get the first round of projects funded in order to begin construction this summer. And several of the projects that we awarded are already moving on construction. So we really had an accelerated timeline for that first round to try and get this program rolling as quickly as possible. But the second round, in order to accommodate the enormous response that we had in the first round, we've tried to announce it earlier to give you more time to work on your projects, and there probably will also be more time between the deadline of the second round and the time when we announce the awardees. And that likely will be announced in early 2020. And then a third round, which will be the completion of the $90 million, will take place sometime in 2020. Projects that were not awarded in the first round are eligible to reapply in the second round, and that will be true for the third round too, as well. Eligible applicants must be either a local unit of government or a 501c3 nonprofit. If awarded, the applicant will be the entity that enters into a state grant agreement and must take responsibility for all aspects of the project through completion. So the applicant must fulfill at least one of the following roles. They need to either own or be acquiring the trail corridor. They need to manage and maintain the trail once developed, or oversee and manage the trail construction through completion. So really, the applicant needs to be the one that's in the driver's seat for this project. Applicants that are merely a fiscal pass-through are not eligible. The entity that signs a contract with the state needs to be responsible for the project so that we can hold you accountable for the project. Eligible projects and costs. So all non-motorized trail types are eligible. We do give some consideration in the evaluation process to multi-use trails, but all surface types are eligible. So that can include mountain biking, equestrian, hiking, backpacking, as well as multi-use trails that accommodate all different types of users. The surface should meet contextual needs for your project, and they must be open to the public. Eligible costs include trail construction, which also includes upgrading surface type. So for example, if you have a crushed stone surface and you want to upgrade that to asphalt, that would be an eligible cost. Land acquisition, design and engineering, and basic trail amenities. So by basic, we mean that which is strictly necessary to support the functionality of the trail. We're not going to fund really elaborate amenities. The idea is to build as much trail as we can with the $90 million. So we have to limit to some degree the amenities that we fund. But basic amenities that are important to support the functionality of the trail, like trailheads and parking, restrooms where necessary, drinking water, etc. Those are eligible costs. So these are some examples of eligible costs and ineligible costs. The eligible ones are on the left-hand side. Ineligible would be on the right. So, for example, bridges, culverts, boardwalks to traverse wetlands areas, directional signage, trailheads, safety railing where necessary. Those are all eligible costs. Ineligible costs include sidewalks, bike lanes that are painted onto a road surface, etc. We don't consider that to be trail. Demolition of structures, interpretive signage, corridor length lighting is not eligible. Irrigation systems, websites, mobile apps, printed maps, brochures, those are not eligible costs under the Next Level Trails program. There is a match requirement for Next Level Trails. The minimum match is 20%. So the way we figure that is your total 100% project cost minus 20% equals your grant amount. The application form is set up to automatically calculate that as you input those costs, but that's the way that we calculate that 20%. Grant requires that minimum. If you don't meet that, it's not an eligible project. We do give consideration to projects that exceed 20%. Eligible match, we've tried to make that as flexible as we can. So that could include monetary contributions, could include land value, previous expenses or donations that are directly related to the project might be credited as match. That's subject to DNR review. If you have a situation like that, talk to us about it. In-kind donations of materials and labor, anything that's being provided to you to support the construction of the trail, if you can assign and document a value for that, could be credited as match. This is just sort of a timeline of how a project would unfold. So we accept the applications, we'll be reviewing and ranking them, announcing the awardees, then the applicant would sign a contract with the state of Indiana, and funds are then provided up front based on project milestones. So this is a little bit different than most trail grants that you might be familiar with. We want to try and provide the funds to you up front so that there are as few hurdles as possible to getting these projects on the ground, and to make sure that as many different type of applicants are able to participate as possible. So like nonprofits that sometimes have a difficulty meeting reimbursement structured programs, we're hoping that this unique element of Next Level Trails will make it a little more accessible to those type of applicants. So funds would be released upfront based on project-specific milestones. So if you're awarded a $5 million grant, we're not going to give you $5 million upfront and let it sit in your account for 4 years. We're going to give you the funds that you need to accomplish certain milestones when you need it. So example like that could be, first you need to complete design and engineering. So we give you the amount of funds that you need to do that. Once that's done, you need to do land acquisition. We provide the funds necessary to complete that. Now you've got the land and the design, you need to go to construction. we'll upfront the funds to complete that phase of the project. So it's kind of a balance between fiscal responsibility on the state side, but also ensuring that the project, the applicant, can be as agile as possible. Projects need to be completed within 4 years of the award. The completion date and milestones will be project specific and will be outlined in that state grant agreement. And trails need to be open to the public for a minimum of 25 years. We prefer perpetuity, but a minimum of 25 years. And all deeds, easements, licenses, etc. Will need to be recorded to reflect that commitment. This is how we do the project selection process. First, DNR reviews applications for eligibility and completeness. This is a period of due diligence in which DNR staff might reach out to the applicant with some questions, a little bit of truthing, ground truthing of the project, and then projects are evaluated based on the preferences and considerations that we'll discuss later in the workshop by a rating committee that's staffed by multiple state agencies. And the projects are then evaluated based on preferences and considerations. That's how we determine which projects are ultimately awarded. Applications compete only with eligible projects within their respective round and category. So for example, regional projects compete against other regional projects. Local projects compete against other local projects. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy to give you a little recap of the first round and a little bit about what we learned in the first round.
Thanks, Mark. Can everybody on the webinar still hear me? Hopefully. All right. So as you guys may have heard Mark say, we got a tremendous response from round one. Starting off, our first clue that we might get a very popular response to this program was probably our workshops that we held in last December and January. We had over 185 people turn out to those 3 workshops. We also had well over 100 people see the webinar either in person live or recorded. So that led to 82 applications by that first February 15th deadline for the first round. And that was proposals located in 42 separate counties. I just want to say that exceeded our expectations. We thought it was going to be popular, but it certainly did. That was actually really exciting for us to see. And we saw just a lot of people's passion in their application for making their communities better through trails, and that really shined through. And it was really, truly inspiring. And our office has worked in trails for quite a long time, so just to see that response was really rewarding. So how the applications broke down, maybe? I have. I'm there? Okay. So the applications broke down roughly about 50-50 between regional and local applications. You can see we had 40 local applicants and 42, which was not necessarily the breakdown of the funds. When it came to the breakdown of the actual funds requested, that was a little bit more in line with the amounts that were available. So roughly about 25% of the requests were local, and 76 of the total requests were regional. But the big number we want you to show you here is it was almost $144 million in grant requests. So that was quite a lot when we only had $25 million to hand out. So similar, there was kind of a 25-75 split again when it came down to proposed mileage, with 242 miles of proposed new miles of trail in Indiana. So that's quite significant. When it came to average requests, the average regional request was $2.7 million roughly. Again, there was a cap of $5 million, so a little bit over halfway there for that request. And then locals was just under the halfway point at $800,000 when they have a $2 million cap in requests. So just to give you a better idea of where people in your respective pool were kind of averaging at. So again, we had almost $144 million in requests. We have a $90 million grant program. If we were only having one round, we would have only been able to fund 63% of the projects, but this was just the initial round, so we were only able to fund 17% of those grant requests. Just want to keep that in mind that we are doing this in rounds. We understand there's a tremendous amount of interest, but we also understand that some projects are ready to go, and we wanted to help do that with a round 1 and a round 2 and a round 3. We're allowing for some applicants, maybe some in this room, to apply for the first time. They might take a little bit more to gather all that information that we require for our application packet and get some planning done on the early stages to still be eligible and have a chance at those funds. So out of the 82 applications, we funded 17 awards, which was roughly 20%. So you can see it's quite competitive. So we announced round 1 on May 2nd in Speedway. As you can see, the governor's here with Speedway Trail Association to announce the awardees. Of those 17 awardees, 10 were regionally significant projects and 7 were locally significant projects. They totaled over 42 miles of trail in 17 different counties, and it was just over $24.9 million in funds that were awarded in May. The interesting thing was that those applicants were totaling $12.5 million in local match value. So again, the program requires a 20% match value, but if you add that up, that's actually $37.4 million invested in trail development, and the locals are providing in this first round roughly 33% or a third of the cost of the trail investment that's going on in Indiana. If you have interest in learning more about the round 1 awardees, we have a link there to the website. There's an entire awards page. You can see a description of all the awardees that were funded in the first round. Again, it was very competitive, but we're really proud, and a lot of them are on their way to making trails happen, so that's really exciting. So our team wanted to provide meaningful feedback in round 1 to the applicants that did not receive a grant, but we also recognized we had a large amount of applicants, making this a little bit difficult. So in order to be efficient with both applicants and staff time, we designed a feedback call system, which provided up to 30 minutes of feedback per applicant. Applicants were able to have multiple people on their end of the phone call via either speakerphone or conference call, and they could hopefully sign up for a time slot that was convenient for them. We sent out multiple email blasts in May, and the calls were mostly held in late May and the entire month of June. We actually had 47 applicants, or roughly 72% of the applicants who did not receive funding sign up for a call. That means we had roughly 23.5 hours of just call time, with about 2 to 3 staffers on each call, plus the prep time and administration time for all of this system. Was well over 100 hours of staff time dedicated to providing feedback to our round 1 applicants. So it was a lot of time, but I think hopefully it was as helpful. We heard back from many of the applicants on the phone call that it was. I hope that anybody else that had a call found it to be useful. I know that we certainly did. We definitely had some feedback that we found out from our applicants of what they liked about the program, what was easy, what can be made a little bit better. So that's probably a good time to transition back to Mark about our second round changes and details. So.
Great. Thank you, Amy.
Oh, do you want me to take that?
So we're not making drastic changes to the program for round 2. It's mostly tinkering around the edges and learning from partially from those feedback calls and just what we saw in the first. Am I not on? I'm on. Can you hear me on the webinar? I lost my train of thought. We're not making massive changes to the program for round 2, but there are a few changes that we're going to implement. Before I jump into that, I guess the second round will be for a total of $30 million. The first round was for 25. So we are ramping up a little bit in the regional side. There will be $25 million available for regional projects in the second round and $5 million available for local projects. Applications and reapplications will be accepted from October 1st through November 1st. We are going to have a hard deadline on November 1st of 5 p.m. Eastern or Central. If we receive your application after that, it will not be eligible. They must be submitted electronically. It will be received through the Next Level Trails email inbox as with the first round, or via Simplicity, which is a state file sharing service that's similar to Google Drive, Box, etc. Those other file sharing services, unfortunately, we can't access them. State IT blocks those. So even though they're kind of the market leader and everybody's real comfortable using Google Drive, Box, etc., we can't use them. So don't submit your application using those services. If your file size is too large to submit to the email address, we'd ask you to email us earlier than the deadline. I think the date we'd ask for is October 25th, and ask us to set you up with a Simplicity link in order to transfer the documents over. We're going to cover that again a little bit later in the process, but it's real important, so we're going to bring it up twice. This is how the timeline will roll out. Governor announced the second round on July 23rd. We're holding these workshops in August. We have another one if you just can't get enough on Tuesday in Spring Mill, and then another week later at Dunes State Park up in the region. We're going to accept those applications again October 1st through November 1st. The review and ranking period will play out over November and December. And then we anticipate announcing the awards sometime in early 2020. We don't have an exact date for that at this point. So the changes I mentioned earlier. The most significant change for round 2 is based on the enormous response that we got in round 1. And so for round 2, we're going to limit it to 1 application per applicant per round. You need to choose either regional or local. So you can't have 1 regional application and 1 local application. You need to pick one or the other, and only 1 application per applicant per round. We've additionally have added a new evaluation criteria for local projects, which is projects that connect trail users to nature. We'll explore that topic a little bit later when we go through all of the preferences and considerations, but that is a new evaluation criteria that applies only to the local pool of applicants. And finally, we have updated on the application packet checklist, which is something that you have in the packet if you're here in the room, the handout. We are now requiring a parcel map and table be required for all applicants. That's number 14 on the checklist. We found in the first round a lot of applicants, we had a number of applicants who kind of did this on their own, and it was extremely helpful for DNR staff to follow exactly which parcels the group owned, which ones they were acquiring, whether or not you had letters of intent for each parcel. And so those parcel maps and table were so useful to us that we are now requiring it going forward. We'll explain even more thoroughly later in the process how to do that. So how to apply or reapply. I guess I'd be interested in the room, how many folks here applied in the first round? So about a third or half of the room. And do you plan to reapply? Good. You've already done the work, so you should. First, I guess for new applicants, this is the process to follow for applying. You need to review first the handbook and especially the application checklist, because both have been updated with some minor tweaks. I already noted number 14 on the requirement for the parcel map and table. The packets must be submitted electronically to nextleveltrails@dnr.in.gov. The state limits attachment size to 19 megabytes. Most applications are going to exceed that, so you have two choices. You can divide the application up into different segments and send in individual emails, and we would encourage you to label the emails, so like Hoosier Trail, email 1, 2, 3, email number 4, final, so it's real easy for us to follow. Keep in mind that others might be transmitting emails at the same time. This definitely happened in the first round, especially in the afternoon of the deadline. We were getting multiple emails from multiple people. So just make it as easy as possible for DNR staff to unpack what you sent us. Keep in mind, if you are transmitting that at the last minute, we will have limited bandwidth available to help with problems. So we would really encourage applicants to send their application ahead of the deadline so that if there is an issue, we want to help you. But we can't help everybody at the same time. So it's in everybody's best interest to send those applications several days ahead of the deadline, if at all possible. The other alternative that's available to you, if you don't want to divide it up via email, or if you have massive maps or other things that are really excessive in size, email us at the same email address with your name and contact information and request to set up a file sharing service. It's called Syncplicity. It's the state's vendor for a safe and secure file transfer protocol. Again, we cannot accept applications through Dropbox, Google Drive, Box. If you've heard of it, they're probably great, but we can't accept them. So don't try. Also, there's some engineering firms and consultant groups that have their own private file transfer setups. Those are hit or miss. We were able to accept a couple of those in the first round, but others we were not able to. It's just much safer for everybody if you use Syncplicity. That way we can guarantee that we'll be able to receive your application. We want to review your application, so that's the best way to do it. Incomplete, paper, or late applications will not be eligible. And again, that deadline is going to be 5 p.m. Eastern on November 1st, 4 p.m. Central. If you are reapplying, many of you we've talked to on the feedback calls about how to do this. But at minimum, you'll need to submit a new application form to nextleveltrails@dnr.in.gov. That application form that you sign and date is your indication to us that you want that application to be considered in the second round. For those who had multiple applications in the first round, again, you'll need to choose one application to be considered in the second round. If you're not going to make any other changes to your application, you want your application to be reconsidered as is, that's all you need to do. If you want to make changes, you're welcome to do that. You can tinker with your application however you like. In those instances, only the documents that you're changing you need to submit to us. So if you've got letters of intent or deeds or other items that you've submitted in the first round that aren't changing for the second round, there's no need to resubmit that. We have your file. We'll just drag it over into a new folder that says round 2. So if it's not changing, there's no need to resend it. If your application did not meet program requirements in some way, you obviously will need to submit the new application form and address those items. We probably talked to you on the feedback calls about specifically what those are. Just make sure that you update those portions of the application. There is no need to resubmit the entire application form unless it's undergone significant, massive changes. If it's easier for you if you are doing wholesale changes and you want to renumber it, have a whole bunch of new information, and it's just easier to resubmit the whole thing, that's totally acceptable. We've tried to make this process as straightforward as we can. So if you're only making minor changes, just submit the changes. If you're making big changes, you can redo the whole thing. So Amy is going to jump in here and talk about the application form itself, and I'll let her do that.
Great, thanks, Mark. So if you're following along either in webinar or in person and you see the application packet checklist, we're basically going to run down that list of the application packet checklist, starting with number 1. If you're a new applicant, did Mark tell you, raise your hand if you're going to be a new applicant in round 2 or round 3? Great, so this might be helpful for you. The application packet checklist is really easy. You can kind of just go through and make sure that you're doing everything on it. If you want to submit it that way, that'd be great. That makes it easier for our review staff to kind of follow along with your application and keeps it really organized. It's not required, but it just makes it easier on us and on you. So I'd encourage you to use that application packet checklist for that. So it doesn't matter if you're a new applicant or a reapplying applicant, you will be submitting an application form. The application form is available on our website, which is under the grant process page, and it's a fillable PDF. That bottom section on the cost breakdown does auto-calculate if you're using it electronically. If you're using it by paper, you will have to get out a calculator or do the math yourself. All new applications and reapplications must be, like I said, submitted for an eligible round. Your application form should reflect the project that you're requesting Next Level Trail grant funding for. We had a few applications that told us, hey, that their project was part of a bigger project that they were working on, maybe something they were working on with their neighbors, or maybe just a larger project in their community that they were working on. Please only have your application form reflect what you're requesting funds for. So if you have a plan to have a 16-mile trail in the future, but this is just the phase 1 and it's 3 miles, make sure that 3 miles and that is reflected in your application form. We like to hear about your larger plans that your trails are part of, the quality of life initiatives, the larger park program that you might be doing, a larger trail network, those kind of things. There are other places in your application that you can tell us about that. Keep your application form focused on what you're requesting the funds for, and be accurate and detailed. Please fill out all boxes that you can. And then one last thing, the application form should be signed by the actual applicant. I know that a lot of people are having consultants that are helping them put together their application packet, and that's fine. However, the applicant, who is the one that would be receiving the funds and enter into that state grant agreement, should be the one that's signing the document and verifying that all that information is correct. So make sure that that's not your consultant signing that. So the second item is your cost breakdown. Your cost breakdown should include 3 key numbers: your total project cost, your total match value, and the grant amount requested. And the way that you get that is your total project cost minus the match should be your grant amount requested, and those numbers on that cost breakdown should match those on the application form. We encourage you to break down your costs by category. This example shows design and engineering, land, trail construction, and monetary contributions. You can choose to do it kind of any way you want, but we do kind of encourage to do it by category. It just makes it easier for us to follow along. Only include eligible costs and match on your cost breakdown. Again, if your project is part of something larger, that's great, but don't include those costs. That gets a little bit confusing for us. Also, your cost estimates need to be pretty detailed and fairly accurate estimates. Breakdowns that are more ballpark or unsupported estimates will not be accepted. We did have a few cost estimates that were very, very rough estimates, very even numbers, a couple of categories. You only kind of get one chance at this grant. We're trying to make sure that you know how much money it's going to cost and that you can build what you say you're going to be building. So this cost estimate helps us to determine that. So the other thing that we saw a lot with cost breakdowns were that they were reflecting a little bit more federally funded projects. Not all of them. We saw a few that were. We would encourage you to try to make sure that they reflect either a state or locally funded project. That probably would be a little bit leaner, as there's some less kind of restrictions with state funds than there are with federal funds. So if you've already had a cost estimate done and it was for a federally funded project and an applicant for that, make sure to take a look at that again and make sure that you're cost estimate for the Next Level Trails program is more reflective of state funding. Costs should in general be kept as lean as possible and contingencies kept to a minimum. We do understand that things come up with your projects, but we are asking you hopefully to do your homework ahead of time and think about those things, and that's why we ask for that detailed cost breakdown. So we don't really like to see contingencies at like 20%. That's unacceptable in our book. The other thing about keeping your costs lean, that does two things for you. That allows your match to be less of a burden. The lower your costs are, the lower that 20% match threshold is, or the more that the threshold that you have for match, it increases the percentage that you have for that. The other thing is, if you're asking for a pretty lean amount in general, we have a $25 million pie for that regional and a $5 million pie for the local. We can only slice it up so much. If you're asking for a smaller slice, you might be more likely to make it in. All match not specifically associated with certain costs should be shown as a monetary contribution. So if you have a match that is specific to a certain cost, so let's say you have donated land or you have someone donating time and labor to clear the corridor, that should go with the line item that it's with. But if you have more just general cash, then that should go separately. Don't assign value to your monetary contributions. Our staff will work with you on when cash match should be used. And just so we are clear, projects are not evaluated on a cost per mile basis. We understand that projects are in different timelines. Some projects have already acquired land, some still need to do that. Some have geographic or site issues of being in a wetlands or needing bridges, so we don't necessarily, or we don't evaluate your project on a cost per mile basis. So when it comes to match documentation, you have to show us what you're using for match and have a value for that. The first way you might do that is if you are the applicant and you're providing funds. The easiest way to do that is provide a statement from your fiscal agent certifying the availability and source of funds. For land value, you'll need to provide an appraisal or an alternative evidence of value acceptable to the DNR. It should be reflective of the type of control you have. So if you are going to be using land that you own in fee, that can be a certain value. If you own it in easement, it would not be the same as if you owned it in fee and reflected in that value. If you're going to use an alternative evidence of value, and you haven't already talked to our land acquisition team, I would probably encourage you to do that if you're not thinking about not doing an appraisal. The reason, I know getting an appraisal is kind of a tough lift, but the reason that we ask you to do this is that we have to determine the value. We're trying to be as flexible as possible with what can be considered match, but we do have to have a value for that land. When you have a monetary contribution or donation of material and labor, you will need a commitment letter or an affidavit from the partner providing that, detailing the value of that commitment. Commitment letters can be contingent on Next Level Trails awards. So let's say, for example, your community foundation says, hey, we'll give you $10,000 if you're awarded a Next Level Trails grant. That's acceptable to us. However, if you're applying for a grant and you have not already been awarded, you can't have pending applications qualify as match. If you are awarded, we just need a copy of that award letter showing us, hey, this other grant gave us a $5,000, we have a $5,000 grant from another source. Here's our award letter. If you're doing materials or labor, you'll need a commitment letter. Materials or equipment should be valued at market value. Labor should be in 3 categories. You'll either have labor that is just general labor, $10 an hour, corridor clearing, brush cutting, simple things like that. If you have somebody that is supervising those general laborers and training those people, that person can be valued at $20 an hour. And then we have hourly rates for professionals. So if you're doing force account labor, or if you have a professional doing maybe excavating for you or plumbing at your trailhead, they can do their hourly rate. We just need documentation showing us how many hours they're going to be donating and what their hourly rate is. Match documentation, one more thing I want to talk about real quick, is if you've done previous work on your trail that is directly related to the trail, you can contact us and let us know what that is. So for example, you've already got design and engineering work. We can value that towards the match. That just means you'll have to show us that design and engineering work, but you also need an invoice and like a canceled check to show us the value of that. And again, that needs to be pertinent to your trail. It can't be some kind of loosely associated with your trail to be considered. So, moving on to item number 4, which is the project narrative. Just real quick, I want to say there's about 3 areas in your application packet where you can really sell your project really well. Again, the application form is the first thing the reviewer and the rating committee will see. Make sure that that's accurate and a good summary of your project. The second place is that project narrative. This is the place where you have the most room to kind of do that salesmanship of your project. You should keep it brief, but this is where you tell them all the important information and why your trail would make a big difference in your community. The first part of the project description should be just a detailed project description. It should talk about trail mileage, width, surface, what uses you're allowing, how it might be an accessible trail, acreage you might be purchasing, the status of the corridor, any special restrictions. If you're a natural surface trail, you might want to include difficulty level. This is the place to have that. The second part of the project narrative is your timeline. We need to see both an estimated start and completion date by month and year. We need to see kind of an estimated timeline for major project milestones, when you might have design and engineering done, when you might be taking bids for construction, when you might be breaking ground, those kind of large things. Again, they don't have to be specific dates, a kind of range, but just so that we know that your project timeline seems reasonable. And then feel free to note any previously completed work that would affect your timeline and possibly accelerate it. So if you've already gotten permits, you've already done design and engineering, let us know in that project timeline. So the third part of the project narrative is that connectivity narrative. This is the place where you'll note connections. Again, connections being a key part of the Next Level Trails program to neighboring cities, towns, counties. And you'll note connections to existing trails. You might note connections to the state visionary trail system, kind of local community attractions, schools, parks, neighborhoods, commercial centers, that kind of thing. If there are large regional attractions that you're connecting through your trail, this is also where you'd want to say that. You can show it on the map, but just make sure you probably let us know in the project narrative as well. Again, another kind of element of this program is that collaboration. So we want you to outline in the project narrative your financial partnerships. These should be on the application form, and you should name all of your partners. But this is something that, again, that the rating committee will look at is the level of your partnerships. Partnerships are considered in our definition that provide substantial value or other resource to your Next Level Trails project. You will need to have that match documentation for every one of those partners, but this is a place where you can further explain those partnerships, what they're providing, how that's important to your project, the relationship that you may have with that partner, why they want to see the trail. This is the place to have that. And the last part is your environmental and cultural resources impact. So you might want to describe where your project is going through, and that will let us know any environmental or cultural resources impacts you may have. You also might note any clearances and permits you anticipate or things that you've already gotten for those. This is also where you submit a copy of your DNR early coordination letter in the application packet. You don't already have to have it completed, but you do have to have that process initiated. NEPA is not required. However, if you've already gotten it done, you can let us know that. This is also kind of this environmental and cultural resources area is where you'd let us know, especially if you're a local project, significant natural areas that your project is going through or highlighting, and how users may engage in nature. So this is definitely about the kind of larger context, environmentally speaking, of your project. So moving on to number 5, which is your site and conceptual map. This is the third area of the 3 that you can really have your application shine and show off to the rating committee. What you'll want to show is your trail route in a local context. You'll want to depict the location of proposed trail amenities or necessary infrastructure. So boardwalks, trailheads, things like that. You'll want to depict that on the map. You'll also show an existing constructed feature. So if you're using a park as your trailhead, make sure that you show that. Or, you know, you've already had bridges completed, let us know that on the map. You'll also depict applicable boundaries. So let us know kind of where the city boundaries are, town, county, park boundaries that are relevant to your project. And then you'll want to key those photos from Section 6, which we'll talk about in a second, to the map. So more things that you'll want to show in your map are those connections that you most likely will be talking about in narrative form, and that connectivity narrative, but connections to other cities, towns, and counties, if that's applicable to your project, existing trails, and when we say existing trails, we're saying trails that are already open or under development, just generally those things, or if the trail particularly is fully funded and is moving forward, just maybe waiting on, you know, timeline things, we're considering that existing trail. Trails that are planned, you may include, but just keep that, maybe let us know that those are planned and keep those different rather than the existing. The other thing you'll want to show us on your map, particularly for the local projects, but the regional projects might also want to do this, show kind of those local attractions or regional attractions right off your trail or nearby. Schools, parks, neighborhoods, commercial centers. We've seen everything from historic bridges, museums. I'm trying to think what else. Just a lot of other kind of amenities, water parks, splash pads, dog parks, anything that really trail users might be interested in making a trip out of. Let us know that on your map. Also, those natural areas or on or near the corridor. Show that depicted on your map. And you'll also label any potential impact to those natural or cultural resources on your map as well. You're, again, welcome to include planned trails, sidewalks, or bike lanes. We understand that there's a larger connectivity issue going on. That may help us understand that a little bit better. Again, just differentiate existing trails from planned trails. Parcels are optional on the site and conceptual map, but they must be shown on your parcel map, which we'll get to in a second. Some tips that we had for like good maps that we saw in round 1. Please include a title, legend, key, scale, north arrow. Sometimes it's a little hard to follow your trail when we, don't even know what way is north. Satellite imagery is certainly recommended. You can actually put it on a different transparency if that's a little bit easier for you. That doesn't overpower your map, but at least lets us see some of the features that are key in your community. Utilize different colors, line patterns, and line weights to identify your project and other things. So it's really confusing when things are all kind of relatively in the same color scheme or the same line weight. You'll want to label major streets for reference, just so we know, especially if you refer to those in your project narrative. You may submit multiple maps. If this is too much information, your project kind of hits a lot of these points and has a lot going for it, that's probably great, but it might be a little bit confusing, so you're welcome to put together multiple maps. Again, the rating committee will be using your map to better understand your project. You've heard a picture's worth 1,000 words, so is your map. This allows them to very quickly visually identify what is going on with their project. So good to have it on there. For site photographs, we do require that. That just lets us know a little bit more about the context of your trail. We encourage you to key these to the map and label them. So an example is number 1, proposed trailhead looking north at Hoosier Boulevard. Let us know what direction that we're looking. That's very helpful. Another example is number 2, looking south on Hoosier Pike. If you are a local project and you're looking at that trail connectivity to trail users connecting to nature, your photographs might be a great spot to show that. So if there are those natural features, this is the place you might also want to spend some time. So design and engineering plans is part 7. It is not required. So if you don't have it done, that's okay. Our grant will actually pay for that. So you're good. However, if you do have it done, we'd like to see that all design and engineering plans that are awarded, or sorry, all awardees will have to have their design and engineering plan looked at by DNR staff before they can be approved for construction at some point. Whether that's done in the application phase or whether that's done later after the design and engineering happens, that we just need to make sure that your trail looks to be sustainably built, looks to be accessible, those kind of things. Our staff will review your project for those. Grantees are not required to hire consultants under the Next Level Trails program. Just want to get that out there. However, any professional services that are hired and compensated with Next Level Trails funds must be performed by an entity that is NDOT pre-qualified. If you are using city staff or community staff or county staff as an engineer, as a planning and design, you don't necessarily have to have that person be NDOT pre-qualified because you're not hiring them. Also, just so we're clear, this is one of the strings that comes along with the funds. The funds are coming to us from NDOT, so we have to require this, but the plans do not have to meet NDOT specifications. So we're clear on that. So if you have design and engineering plans, please include them. If you don't, you don't necessarily have to meet that, but if you aren't including design and engineering plans, we will make sure that you are asking for design and engineering fundings unless your project may not require full design engineering. Some natural surface trails may not. So we ask for any examples of regional, local, or comprehensive plans that your project is in. What we're asking for is the name of the plan, the date of the plan, a copy of the pages relevant to the plan if it's a hard copy. If it's available online, you can just provide the link and the applicable pages. Your project may be part of multiple plans. That's a good thing. Examples of plans that your project may be a part of: a regional cities plan, a comprehensive county or a city plan, a Parks and Rec master plan, a bike pedestrian plan, or active transportation plan. A lot of MPOs, counties, or cities have trails plans. Some trails groups even have trail or corridor specific plans. Any one of those or something else is probably good to show in your application. It's good to show as many as possible, which shows a kind of a support and value of your project within your community. That's kind of what we're trying to get at. So we're looking for in section 9, a summary and management and maintenance plan, which should be 1 page or less. Please explain how you plan to manage and maintain the project for its useful life, which we consider about 25 years. In that, you might want to articulate kind of the costs that you think might be occurring within that 25 years and where funding sources might come from. We know that the biggest hurdle for a lot of you, and that's probably why you're in this room, is the development of the trail, but there are associated costs with it its entire life, whether that is fixing potholes and taking out trash and cutting down trees. There's a variety of different things that we just hope that you can show us that you're kind of planning for. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Mark. Okay.
Item number 10 on the checklist is jurisdictional approval letter and letters of support. So applicants must provide a letter of support from the jurisdictional authority, so that could be, depending on the location of your trail, county, city, town, etc. So if you're in a rural part of the county, that would be the county commissioners or the county council. If you're in town, that could be the city council or the mayor. The point here is that you have a letter of support from somebody that is accountable to voters. So they don't need to provide funds. It's simply a check from our side that we're not going to fund a project that that is opposed by the local unit of government. Applicants may provide additional letters of support from key stakeholders or the community at large to demonstrate the breadth of community support for the project. Please limit these within reason. We don't want 150 of these letters that are all the same. But if you have 10 or 15 from notable big businesses in the community, different philanthropies, etc. We would like to see those. Letters of support, though, do not constitute partnerships. So partnerships, the definition of that under the Next Level Trails program are entities that are providing a significant financial contribution to the project. And just to jump back to the jurisdictional authority, examples of letters that we would not count in that category would be like a letter from the planning department, or a letter from the city engineer, or a letter from the parks department. It needs to be somebody who is held accountable to voters. Item number 11 is a project contact list. Please provide a list of individuals or groups that will be directly involved in the development of the trail so that we know how to get a hold of them. That could be, this list is not necessarily the list that you will have, but examples could be project manager. One that we certainly will need is the contract signatory. Fiscal manager, if you have somebody that's managing the finance side of it. Project engineer, those are examples of contact information we'd like you to submit as part of the application. Address, phone number, and email address is what we need. So now, item number 12 and 13 has to do with current easements and deeds. These are properties that you already own that you're going to build the property on, or build the trail on. Provide a copy of the recorded deed, lease, or easement for each property currently controlled by the applicant and intended for development through Next Level Trails. In addition to that, provide us with any existing easements, such as utilities, access drives, etc., that pertain to those properties. So if you have a piece of property and there's an REMC electrical easement that goes across it, provide a copy of that easement in addition to the deed. A real common one that could happen, especially in rural areas, might be easements that go across like driveways or access, etc. We need to know about any other rights that people hold that impact the property that you own. If the project is to be built in right-of-way, you need to prove that you have control of that right-of-way for trail use, or have an official letter, or if you're like a nonprofit that's proposing to use city right-of-way, you need to have documentation from the city stating that they control that right-of-way and are willing to let you use it. If you are proposing to use INDOT right-of-way, you need to have a letter or communication from INDOT stating that they have reviewed your proposal and that they are agreeable to what you have proposed. I would encourage you to reach out to your district office, INDOT district, very soon if you're intending to do that. Depending on how much right-of-way you want to use from INDOT, they're going to have something to say about how you do that. So open that line of communication early and coordinate with INDOT, and you'll need to provide us communication from INDOT that what you're planning is satisfactory. So examples of that include if you're crossing a state road, if you're trying to run laterally along a state road, you need to have communication from INDOT on that. So the following items on the checklist pertain only to those projects that include land acquisition as part of the project. So if yours doesn't include this, you can just check NA when you submit the checklist along with your application. Land that is acquired or donated in fee simple through Next Level Trails must remain in public outdoor recreation use in perpetuity. That will be accomplished via a deed restriction that you will file on the property, on the deed. Land acquired by easement through Next Level Trails must remain in public trail use for a minimum term of 25 years. We would much prefer to see perpetuity, but the minimum allowable is 25 years. Licenses might be acceptable in limited circumstances with DNR approval. If you're proposing a license agreement, talk to us before you apply. A common example of that, particularly in Northwest Indiana, is NIPSCO right-of-way, utility right-of-way, that kind of thing. It might only be doable through a license agreement, but we're going to need to review the terms of that license, et cetera, and would encourage you to turn that over to us ahead of time so that we have a chance to provide some input on it before you apply. Number 14 on the checklist. This is new for those who applied in the first round. We saw in the first round there were some applicants that did a really great job of this, and we liked it so much that we're going to require it. So we need to see a parcel map that clearly shows what you own and what you intend to acquire, and then key each parcel to a table. And the table, there's an example of this in your handout for those in the room. It's also online as a part of the application handbook if you're on the webinar. But the table will include key, so you can come up with whether you letter them, number them, whatever, we don't care. But include the parcel ID from the county parcel data. Include the name of the property owner. If you have a letter of intent from them, check that box. If you've already acquired it, that won't be applicable. Any existing easements that might pertain to it, you'd list those in the table. So, for example, if there's a natural gas easement or a power line easement, et cetera, just note that so that we know to look for it in your application packet. Note whether or not it would be acquired as a part of this project. And then the general size of it. So if it's real small, that could be square feet. If it's much larger than that, acreage, et cetera. And then finally, the value, the anticipated value of that acquisition. This will make it so much easier for DNR to review this component of the application. And honestly, land acquisition is the hardest part of any one of these projects. So anything you can do to make this very clear for us to understand will help everybody. I think we already covered all of that in the last slide. Number 15 is evidence of value. So for each acquisition that will occur during the project, we ask you to provide an appraisal or alternative evidence of value that's acceptable to DNR. The value needs to be reflective of the acquisition type. So if you're acquiring it in fee, it needs to be valued as though you're acquiring it in fee. If you are acquiring an easement, it needs to be valued as an easement, not as fee value. All of that is subject to review by DNR land acquisition staff. If you are doing acquisition, the earlier that you reach out to us and talk about it, the better it will be for everybody, because we can guide you through that. There's also a big resource available on our website called the Real Estate Handbook that dives into this in great detail. I would encourage you to find that on the website and read it. There's a lot of valuable information in there about this process. Number 16 on the checklist is letters of intent. For each acquisition of real estate that will occur within the project, the applicant must provide either a letter of intent, a signed option, executed purchase agreement, or a commitment letter demonstrating willingness of the whether that be the applicant or the relevant authority to exercise eminent domain if needed. We don't encourage eminent domain. We're going to cover that on the next slide. But this is an area, letters of intent is an area that tripped up some people in round one. If you're intending to acquire land and we're going to fund your project, we need to have a really solid confidence that you're going to be able to acquire that land. And so that's what the purpose of the letter of intent is. We want to make sure that it's not speculative, that you might be able to buy something, maybe. So that's why we ask you to do this. There is an example of the letter of intent available on our website. There's also a sample cover letter that you're welcome to use. It should, if it is a donation or bargain sale, it should clearly state the seller's intention to donate or sell the land below market value in the letter of intent. We will We will view projects with land acquisition that's under option or contract. We're going to view those favorably because that's much more secure than a letter of intent. So if you're able to do that, that's much to your advantage. And then as an alternative to letters of intent, first of all, the right of eminent domain is something that should only be used when all other options have been exhausted. We don't encourage its use at all. We're simply saying that we are willing to approve projects that include it. If you're not able to secure a letter of intent from the landowner, the relevant authority needs to sign a letter or a memo stating that they'd be willing to exercise eminent domain if it came to it. You can see that memo on the website to reference what should be included in that commitment letter. And I encourage you to take a look at that and read through it carefully. So Amy's going to jump in and go over a few other required items, and then we will dive into the evaluation criteria that we rank these projects against.
Thanks, Mark. So if you are planning on applying, let's just plan ahead and see if you are awarded. So, there we go. In order to do business, if you are awarded with the state, you would be considered what we call a vendor in our state accounting system. In order to be a vendor, we would need to have a W-9 and a direct deposit form from you. These forms are not required to be part of your application packet. They actually have to be submitted to DNR vendor forms before the round deadline. You can choose to put them into your application packet to show us that you also submitted it to them, or you can CC us on the email, that's fine. Basically what we want to make sure is that you're eligible to get money and we know where the bank account is to give you money if you are awarded. Both of these documents are available on our grant process page on our website. The other thing that you are considered if you're doing business with the state and you are awarded a grant is a bidder. You aren't necessarily bidding on projects, you're applying for a grant, but that's just the language that they tend to use. But what happens if you are a bidder is that you're in the system is that you're allowed to electronically sign your state grant agreement with the Department of Natural Resources or a contract in their same terms. So it's fairly easy to register or update your IDOA bidder profile if you already have a profile, and can be done online at their website. They actually also have an easy kind of quick guide to go through that. Some of the questions are more targeted towards businesses. So if you're a community or a nonprofit, some of them might not be as applicable to you, or you might have to kind of figure out how those work a little bit better. And in order to show us that you have been determined as a state bidder, all you need to do is either send us a screenshot with your bidder ID number, or just put down your bidder ID number somewhere in your application, hopefully following your kind of towards the end there, so that we can just double check that we would be able to do a grant agreement with you if you're awarded. The last section really only applies to nonprofits. To be eligible, you have to be a 501c3 nonprofit, and we need to see proof of that. An IRS letter of determination is the absolute easiest way to do that. You should include this in your application packet, or some other sufficient documentation showing that status in the application packet. Additionally, nonprofits must be registered with the Indiana Secretary of State of Office to be eligible for Next Level Trails. You don't need to show us that in your application packet, but just something that you need to know in general if you are a nonprofit, that you should be doing that all the time anyway. Also, please note, any nonprofits that are awarded funds will need to submit an entity annual report, also known as a Form E1, to the Indiana State Board of Accounts for oversight. That's just how that works if you're a nonprofit getting state assistance. So we're going to jump into evaluation criteria. I want to remind everybody that the DNR Next Level Trails team reviews your project on all of the technical aspects and kind of does that fact-finding. So a lot of the stuff that was in the application packet isn't necessarily very relevant to the rating committee, but they will double check that to make sure that you're eligible, that your project seems feasible, those kind of things. Once they've done that, we do have a process where we hand that your application off to that rating committee who evaluates your project on how well it meets the different preferences and considerations. The rating committee will judge your project and how many of those preferences and considerations meet and how well you meet them in your given pool in the given round. In order to create your most competitive application, we're going to kind of go through each one of these, but we'll start kind of with an overview. The important thing to note here is that preferences are the primary evaluation tool that the rating committee will look at, and considerations are the secondary evaluation tools. As noted by the blue circle, projects that further complete the state visionary trail system only apply to regional projects. With the yellow or the gold circle there, projects that connect schools, parks, neighborhoods, commercial centers, and local attractions is a preference that's specific to the local projects. All the other preferences listed are applicable to both regional and local projects. Again, considerations are secondary, but they are still important. Noting on this side, the blue projects that are part of a national or multi-state trail system is a consideration, again, for just regional projects. The ones delineated in gold, projects in counties considered deficient in trail miles per capita, and projects that connect trail users to nature are specific to local projects only. All the other considerations are applicable to both regional and local projects. We understand that your project will most likely not meet all the preferences and the considerations. That's pretty normal. In order to have the most competitive application as possible, we'll want you to try to meet as many of them as possible and to do it at a high quality. The ones that do that will probably rise to the top and are most likely to get funded. So don't focus on something that your project probably isn't necessarily applicable to your project. Focus on ones that they do really well and maybe can do better, or things that you might be able to do with those preferences and considerations. So the first preference that we're going to talk about, which is again for regional projects only, is preferences given to projects that further the completion of the state visionary trail system. How many people in the room are familiar with the state visionary trail system? Oh, this is going to be easy. Okay, great. So this is actually one of the things that was driven out of our stakeholder meeting we had back in September. We had a large number of trail stakeholders that kind of provided some guidance on what they'd like to see with the Next Level Trails program. The State Visionary Trail System has been in existence since 2006 in our State Trails Plan back then. We did a new, an updated version in 2016. The important thing to note about the State Visionary Trail System is that it is stakeholder driven. So people such as yourselves all across the state come let us know what projects they want to see happen, what they're working on, and how these trails are going to cross county lines and connect to each other. And then we use that feedback to create the State Visionary Trail System. And again, it's in that State Trails Plan. And we've been working on this for quite some time here in Indiana. So that's why this is one of those preferences. Just so you know, for this, the way that this criteria is applied, both visionary and potential visionary trails are eligible for this preference. This map's available online in an application handbook. It's also in the very back of the room if you have any more questions. But just know that the rating committee will be looking on, if you are part of that visionary trail system, they'll look at the significance toward the completion of the system. That's how they evaluate that. And there's nothing that you necessarily need to show us. You might say it in your trail connectivity narrative, but we can generally figure out pretty easy in our office if your project is part of the State Visionary Trail System or not. So this preference is for local projects. It's preference given to projects that connect, again, schools, parks, neighborhoods, commercial centers, and local attractions. We look at the number of connections, significance, and quality of connections. Again, local attractions can be up to you. So if you have a museum, you have a library that's well used in your community, a water park, things like that, just note that here. Again, note it on the map and note it in your connectivity narrative. That's how you'll communicate that to the rating committee. And they'll look for, they're really looking for projects they'll make a big quality of life improvement for people living in your community, as far as easy access and transportation network and recreation network. So these preferences are for all projects, again, both local and regional. Preferences given to they're given to projects that connect multiple cities, towns, or counties. Again, based on the number and significance and quality of connections. The easiest way to show this in your map is showing those jurisdictional lines. You can also include this in your connectivity narrative, and there's a spot on your application form where it says where your project may be going through, so you'll include that there. We had a number of regional projects that were able to do this. They connected different cities and towns. Some of them even crossed county lines in the round one. So that was excellent to see. The local projects tend to do this a little bit less, but there are still projects that do this, so we consider this a preference. But most of our local projects are looking at kind of connections within the community, but occasionally they're looking for connections to connect the town to maybe a regional park or to the neighboring town that's pretty close by. So again, if you have any of those connections, make sure that you highlight that on the map and in the connectivity narrative and the application form. Preference will be given to projects that connect or extend existing trails. We're especially looking for those that close gaps or make critical connections. You can make multiple connections with your trail project. We had several projects that connected to multiple existing trails. You can also have a trail project that extends an existing trail on multiple ends. That's definitely doable. Your project should be contiguous or the same corridor, but if there's kind of an existing trail or some kind of circumstance where you can't have it be contiguous, as long as it's part of the same project, that works. How you kind of connect, or how you highlight this in your application packet. Again, there's a spot on the application format. It's really easy to tell from your map. Again, differentiate between those existing trails and planned trails, and then in your connectivity narrative. In the last round, we saw all kinds of connections. Again, we had trails that connected that we were going to be constructing with Next Level Trails funds, or they were asking for Next Level Trails funds for that would connect to multiple trails. The goal of this is to kind of create a larger system and a larger network. So more preferences that apply to all projects are preferences given to projects that maximize partnerships. Again, partners provide something of kind of financial value to the completion of your project. We are looking at both the breadth and the depth of those partnerships. So we had everybody in the first round apply. We had some that had no partnerships at all, and we had some that had partners on 90 different partners providing substantial value to the project. We also had partners that were providing a couple $100,000 in value to the project. So we had some that are providing $5,000. We look at all of that. The rating committee subjectively looks at that and takes all of that into consideration. Some of the examples of partners that we saw in the first round, landowners. A lot of landowners donating their land either in fee or in easement. We saw local businesses, community foundations, nonprofits, hospitals, individuals. We encourage you, I know this is kind of a unique program where we're looking at partnerships. Most of you guys are probably more familiar with a standard 20% match or 50% match, and that's usually all on the applicant to provide. We are looking for partnerships. We're hoping that this helps lessen the burden on you to get all that match on your own. We also hope that this kind of plants that seed to providing those partnerships moving forward as you manage and maintain that trail. And we're hoping that this also, for us, shows us that there's a lot of support within your community. Again, whether that's individuals or corporations or landowners or whoever else, that they are supportive of that project. The way you'll show this in your application, make sure you have it on the application form right there up front. It's really easy to do that. Make sure you have that, if you had multiple land donations, list them out as people so we can just count them up really easily. And then you're also going to have it in your fiscal partner narrative. And then for every one of those, we do need to see that backup information in the match documentation that they are a partner and what the value is that they're that they are supplying to your project. Another preference that we have is given to projects on an accelerated timeline. It's based on that realistic completion date with upfront funds. There's a 4-year maximum, but we are encouraging anybody that can realistically be aggressive to do so. You can show this on the estimated completion date on the application form is where you should show that in particular, and then back that up with the accelerated timeline that's in the project narrative. In the first round, we had projects that were scheduled to be done later this year, and we had projects that were scheduled to be done at the end of 2022. So just giving you a range of kind of what we saw in round 1. And the reason that we have the accelerated timeline and we want to see this is we're spending a lot of funds on trails. We value a lot of important connectivity, but it'd be great to be able to have trails on the ground sooner for people to be enjoying in your community. So that's just a little bit why we have that preference. And then the last preference for all projects is preferences given to projects that are part of an existing regional, local, or comprehensive plan. Again, based on the number, significance, and quality of plans, preferences given to preferences will also be given to long planned projects. So if you've been working on your project for 20 plus years, let us know. That shows that it's been a priority. This is an example of a regional project. If you're from Northwest Indiana, it's the Greenways and Blueways plan, and it pretty much includes all of their communities, so it's pretty low-hanging fruit. Most of this category is low-hanging fruit. Again, put this in Section 8, but if you're part of a plan, even a little bit, put it in Section 8. Obviously, multiple plans may be included. And like I said, we look at a variety of different things. We had some projects that we knew that probably were parts of plans that didn't submit that in their application, and it's hard to evaluate them when you say, well, I think they're part of it, but they're not quite, and the rating committee may not know that. And then we had some that were part of, like I said, multiple planning efforts. Maybe they're part of their regional trails and greenway plan. Maybe they also had a county one that's specific to them. They might even have a trail corridor plan, so or an active transportation or bike ped. Like I said, as many of those that you can have. Let us know, that the people in your community are supportive of this project, that they find it to be a priority, that it's been vetted by the public. We want to see that, and this is where we kind of evaluate that. So I'll give it over to Mark to kind of go through considerations.
So the good news is that we're on the home stretch. Once we'll run through the considerations, and then after that we'll have time for questions. Preferences are the priority evaluation criteria for next level trails. Consideration is weighed a little bit below the preferences. So still important, but preferences are the priority evaluation criteria. For regional projects only, we do give consideration to projects that are part of a national or multi-state trail system. So some examples of that would be the American Discovery Trail, the Great American Rail Trail, Ohio River Greenway, Marquette Greenway, etc. The arrows on this map point to a few of those. Use the map and the connectivity narrative in the application packet to highlight those connections. Consideration for local projects only. There's a version of this map on an easel in the back of the room that you can check out. We give consideration to projects that are located in counties that are considered deficient in trail miles per capita. So that's based on Indiana Trails Inventory and 2010 U.S. Census data that we calculated. Again, only applicable to local projects, and this is a new criteria for round 2. Consideration given to projects that connect trail users to nature. We anticipate that this category is going to be awarded conservatively. I guess an example of that is a trail outside here along Post Road is in the shade. Okay, that's not really access to nature. If you were to go into the park through the heart of the woods, that would be access to nature. If your trail traverses a wetland area, if it is, along a riparian corridor, along a creek, or along a river for most of it. And you're really providing opportunities for trail users to interact with nature. That's what this category is about. It's not going to be a category that every project is going to meet. But again, it's just one of the considerations. It's not, this is not the major evaluation criteria. So use the map, photos, in the environmental section of the narrative to highlight any of these natural areas, call them out on the map. And again, this will be awarded subjectively based on meaningful and substantial connections to nature. So the remainder of these are for all projects. Consideration will be given to projects that are offered in collaboration with another Next Level Trails applicant. This goes back to the theme at the very beginning from the governor about working together to build trails. Projects must be submitted as one of 2 or more directly connecting Next Level Trails proposals. You should note this on the application form. One thing I do want to call out is that if you applied collaboratively in the first round and your neighbor was awarded the project, your application still qualifies for these for this consideration. So again, this is 2 projects that are next to each other that are working collaboratively to build out a corridor. It's also important to note that even though you're working collaboratively on the corridor, your projects still compete against each other. So just that's something that I think we could maybe have done a better job of explaining in the first round. We do give consideration to projects that exceed the minimum 20% match. We talked about that earlier in the workshop. The evaluation of this is based on the field of applicants, in other words, the range. Should note the match percentage on the application form. It should auto-calculate if you're punching that in online. And you need to prove those, the match that you're providing in the documentation that you submit, in the cost breakdown and in the supporting information in the application. Consideration is given to projects that develop the most miles of trail. Again, this is based on the field of applicants. Should be noted on the application form and shown on the map. DNR is going to evaluate or verify all of the mileage via ArcGIS. Do not include mileage of the larger project. So if it's part of, if you've already got 15 miles on the ground and you're building 3, don't describe it as an 18-mile trail. You're building a 3-mile trail with Next Level Trails funding. That's how we'll evaluate it. And also do not include existing or parts of the trail that would be facilitated by sidewalk or bike lanes painted on the road. That won't count for mileage. We do give consideration to projects that accommodate multiple types of trail uses. So, for example, if you were to build a paved trail with an equestrian side path that's also accessible to mountain bikers, you're accommodating a vast array of different user types. Folks who want to walk, run, push a stroller with small wheels, rollerblade, various types of bikes with different types of tires, all could use that path. If you're building just an asphalt trail that doesn't provide access to equestrian use, that would be a little bit lower ranked. If you're building a crushed stone path, that's still an eligible surface, but there are some user types like rollerbladers, et cetera. Somebody with really small or thin wheels on their bicycle may not be able to use that trail all the time, so that's evaluated a little lower. Again, that's just one item of evaluation. That's not the whole thing. But we do give consideration to projects that are open to the most different user types. How many people are familiar with the state's goal to provide a trail within 5 miles of every Hoosier? Great. That came out of the same project that birthed the Visionary Trail System. That was a priority of Governor Daniels and later updated by Governor Pence. We're basically, I think, at 96% of that goal. And if you look at the map, the remaining 4% is going to be like household by household because it's in very rural parts of the state. But we will provide consideration to projects that do help us meet that goal. So if your project is located in an area that would serve newly served people who aren't served by a trail within 5 miles, we'll give consideration for that. And that's based on the trails inventory and, again, the 2010 census data. And finally, we do give consideration for the statewide distribution of funds. We're not going to award $30 million to Marion County. We're not going to award $30 million to the region. There's going to be some distribution of funds across the state. So that's based on the field of applicants, but it is something that we do take into consideration.
Jump in and jump back a little bit, I guess.
I skip one?
No, I just want to talk about kind of how we saw the considerations within round one. So when it came to collaboration, we probably had about 10 to 15 of those 82 projects that were collaborating together, just to kind of give you a range of who was doing that. When it came to match, we had applicants coming in at the bare minimum, and then we had a few that had over 50% match in both the local and the regional pool. But it seemed that, you know, a lot of people kind of coming in at, you know, maybe a 25 to 35% range. That seemed fairly common. But we did see, like I said, a range through that. When it came to miles of trail, the regional probably was about low end. A 3/4 of a mile trail or so was on the lower end, with the higher end being over 4.5 miles, and most of them coming in around 2 or 3 miles for those regional trails. When it came to the local side, the lower end was probably under a 1/2 mile, and the higher end was over 3 miles, with most being kind of in between that 1/2 mile to 2 mile range. Multiple uses, I don't think we need to talk about that. We did have just a small handful that met that 5 mile requirement, so that was good to see. But if you don't meet that, don't feel like, you know, that's something huge. It's a very small percentage of the applicants that are doing that. And then statewide distribution. So hand it back over to you, Mark.
Yeah, on user types, I would say the vast majority of applicants in round one were building an asphalt or hard surface trail, a paved trail. We did have a few that included, for example, an equestrian side path. Did have some that were crushed stone, accessible crushed stone. But I'd say the majority of the field was paved. So there may be some benefit to you if you can accommodate a side path for equestrian use. If you're able to facilitate that, it might benefit your application. So I want to draw your attention to some resources that are available on our website. Of course, the applicant handbook, which includes the checklist and the application form. In your handout, you have a piece of paper called Doing Business with the State of Indiana that references vendor and bidder registration information, direct deposit forms, etc. We have posted on our website a real estate handbook. If your project involves land acquisition, I strongly recommend that you read that. It also, we have a sample cover letter and letter of intent that you're welcome to use for your project. And there's a memo regarding the use of eminent domain. And finally, the grantee handbook is really aimed at those projects that have been awarded. But there might be some information in there that would be useful as you go through the application process. So I would encourage you to read the grantee handbook as well. And all of that is available on the grant process section of the Next Level Trails website. I also want to point out that if you have questions after this workshop at any point, please email us at nextleveltrails@dnr.in.gov. We'd like to direct those questions through the email versus calling staff directly. It just is a much more efficient way for us to handle those requests. And with that, we would like to entertain any general questions that you have. So these would be questions that you think would be broadly applicable to other folks in the room. If you have a very project-specific question, we're going to hang around when we're done, and that would be the most appropriate time to try and answer that. We're also going to try and facilitate questions from the webinar. So if you have a question, if you'd stand up, say your name, either where you're from or the project you're working on, and we'll do our best to answer it.
Yeah. And just real quick, for those of you, there's a few